change your opinion mid-conversation because you felt the other person pulling away. You laugh at something that hurt you because confronting it felt too risky. You say, "I'm fine," when you are not, because needing something felt like too much to ask. You check your phone for the 10th time, waiting for a response that isn't coming. And something in your chest tightens. Not just impatience, something older, something that whispers, "If they don't choose me, it means something about me." That whisper is the problem, not the silence, not the unanswered message, not the person who keeps disappearing and reappearing. The whisper. Most people in that moment will tell themselves a story, that they're too needy, too sensitive, too much, that the solution is to care less, to seem more indifferent, to become the kind of person who doesn't need anything from anyone. They try to perform detachment the same way they performed warmth before, desperately, strategically, for an audience of one. It doesn't work, because the problem was never how much you care. The problem is where you placed your value. Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the psyche, not the surface, but the foundation. What he found was not flattering. He found that most people never develop a real relationship with themselves. They develop relationships with their own reflection in other people's eyes. They learn, early and painfully, that certain parts of them are acceptable and certain parts are not. So they bury the unacceptable parts and build a version of themselves designed to be loved. And then they spend the rest of their lives performing that version, waiting for someone to finally confirm that it worked. That is not love. That is audition. And the exhausting, humiliating truth of begging for affection is this: you are not begging because you lack love from others. You are begging because you never gave it to yourself. You projected your wholeness, the completeness that can only be built internally, onto other people. You handed them the power to decide whether you are worth anything. And now you are at their mercy, not because they are cruel, but because you made them your mirror, and you cannot exist without your reflection. Jung called this psychological fragmentation. You are not a whole self reaching toward connection. You are a fragment searching for the missing pieces in someone else's hands. And as long as you operate from that place, no amount of affection will be enough. Because what you are actually hungry for cannot be given by another person. It can only be built. This video is about that construction, not the easy version, not the kind that tells you to love yourself with a morning routine and a journal prompt. The real version, why the begging started, what it costs you, and what it actually takes to stop. Jung's framework doesn't offer comfort, it offers precision. And precision, when it lands on the right wound, is the only thing that actually heals. Being agreeable is not a virtue. In most cases, it is a survival strategy you forgot you adopted. You learned it young, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, through 1,000 small recalibrations. You expressed something real: anger, need, opinion, grief. And the response you got taught you that this part of you was inconvenient, too much. So you filed it away. You built a version of yourself that was easier to be around, easier to approve of, easier to love. And it worked. People responded better to the performance than they ever had to the real thing. Jung called this the persona, the mask constructed at the boundary between self and world. Every person has one. That is not the problem. The problem is when you forget it is a mask. When you wear it so long and so completely that you begin to believe the performance is you and the real thing underneath is the stranger. Here is what that costs you. Every relationship you build from behind the mask is a relationship built with someone who doesn't exist. The warmth you receive is real, but it is directed at a fiction. And some part of you knows this. Some part of you registers, underneath every compliment and every moment of closeness, a quiet and persistent dread. If they knew the real me, they would leave. That dread is not paranoia. It is the logical conclusion of a life spent auditioning. And so the begging intensifies, because you are not just seeking affection anymore. You are seeking proof that the performance is working. Every ignored message is a crack in the mask. Every withdrawal of attention feels like exposure. You do not fear losing them. You fear being seen and found insufficient. What makes this especially cruel is that the mask attracts exactly the wrong people. The ones who stay are staying for the performance, which means they need you to keep performing. The moment you slip, the moment something real leaks through, the dynamic shifts. They become uncomfortable. You sense it, and you recalibrate again, burying whatever just surfaced, tightening the mask. The relationship becomes a contract, your authenticity in exchange for their approval. And you keep paying because the alternative, being real and being rejected for it, feels unsurvivable. This is the trap Jung identified with devastating clarity. The persona does not protect you from rejection. It guarantees a particular kind of rejection, the kind where you are never truly known and therefore never truly chosen. You receive approval, occasionally, for the version you perform. But approval is not love. Approval is what you get when the audition goes well. Love is what becomes possible when you stop auditioning entirely. The question, then, is not how to perform better. It is what you buried in order to perform at all, and what it would mean to stop hiding it. That buried material has a name in Jung's framework. He called it the shadow. And before you can understand why you beg, you need to understand what you gave away to seem lovable, and where it went. But first, there is another mechanism operating beneath the surface, one that turns other people into something they were never meant to be. In the next part, we'll examine exactly how you hand your wholeness to someone else, and why that act, disguised as love, is what makes real love impossible. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You have been told your whole life that love means finding your other half, that somewhere out there is a person who completes you. It sounds like romance. It is actually a psychological emergency. Jung was precise about what happens when you meet someone and feel that overwhelming pull, that sense of recognition, of finally, of this is the one. He did not call it love. He called it projection. What you are experiencing is not the other person. It is yourself. The parts of yourself you never developed, never integrated, never allowed to exist, reflected back at you through their face. The intensity is real. But the object of that intensity is largely a fiction you constructed and placed over a human being who had no idea they were auditioning for the role. This is how projection works. You carry inside you a wholeness you never claimed, qualities, capacities, depths, things that belong to you but that you buried, dismissed, or never cultivated. When you encounter someone who seems to embody those things, something in the unconscious lights up. Not because they are your destiny, because they are carrying something that was always yours. And then the dependence begins. When they give you attention, you feel complete. When they withdraw it, you collapse. You interpret this as proof of how much you love them. Jung would interpret it differently, as proof of how much you have invested in them psychologically. There is a difference between loving a person and needing them to hold the missing pieces of yourself together. One is connection, the other is outsourcing. The begging makes perfect sense from inside this dynamic. If they are carrying your wholeness, then losing them means losing yourself. Of course you chase. Of course you tolerate what you should not tolerate. Of course you send the message one more time, accept the scraps, reshape yourself to keep them close. You are not being weak. You are trying to survive the loss of something that feels like a part of you. Because psychologically, it is. You projected it there, and now you need them to stay so the illusion of completeness can hold. What Jung understood, And what makes this so difficult to accept is that the solution is not to find someone better to project onto. The solution is to take the projection back, to look at everything you have placed in that other person, the strength, the worth, the sense of being enough, and recognize it as yours, not theirs to give, yours to build. The moment you begin doing that, the desperate quality of your attachments starts to shift, not because you stop caring about people, but because you stop needing them to be something they were never meant to be. But projection alone does not explain the full pattern, because if you pay close attention, you will notice something uncomfortable. You do not choose unavailable people randomly. You choose the same person over and over, wearing different faces. That is not bad luck. That is a wound with a logic. And in the next part, we'll follow that logic back to where it began. You do not keep choosing the wrong people because you are unlucky. You keep choosing them because some part of you is trying to finish something that was never resolved. Look at the pattern honestly. The person who is warm one day and cold the next. The one who is always slightly out of reach. Available enough to keep you hoping, distant enough to keep you working. The one who makes you feel like love is something you have to earn, prove, perform for. You have met this person before, not them specifically, but this dynamic, this particular emotional geometry. You know exactly how it feels because you felt it first somewhere else, a long time ago, with someone who was supposed to be safe. Jung identified this as the compulsion to repeat, the unconscious drive to recreate unresolved emotional situations in the hope of finally getting a different outcome. The logic, beneath awareness, goes something like this. If I can just get this person to choose me, to stay, to finally give me what I need, then the original wound will heal. It never works. But the unconscious does not learn from failure the way the rational mind does. It tries again and again, with the same emotional blueprint, different faces. What you are really chasing is not the person in front of you. You are chasing a resolution that was never offered to you as a child. The parent who was emotionally unavailable. The caregiver who gave affection conditionally. Present when you performed, absent when you needed. You learned in that environment that love is unstable, that it must be fought for, that your needs are too much, and your value is negotiable. You did not choose to learn this. It was simply what the evidence showed. And now, decades later, that lesson runs silently in the background of every relationship you enter. You are drawn to the familiar tension not because you enjoy suffering, but because the unresolved pulls at you. The wound wants to close, so it keeps creating situations that resemble the original injury, hoping this time the ending will be different. This time, they will stay. This time, they will choose you without conditions. This time, you will finally feel like enough. The cruelest part is that even when someone genuinely available appears, someone consistent, warm, present without games, they often feel wrong, boring, too easy. Without the familiar tension, the unconscious does not recognize it as love. It recognizes it as absence of feeling. And so, you pull away from the person who could actually meet you and return to the one who keeps you reaching. There is something else worth naming here. The repetition is not just about who you choose. It is about how you behave once you are inside the dynamic. The hypervigilance, the constant reading of tone, of silence, of response time. The way a single cold message can undo days of security. You develop that sensitivity as a child because you had to. Reading the emotional temperature of an unpredictable caregiver was a survival skill. But you carried it into adulthood, and now it fires in contexts where it no longer serves you. You are not overreacting. You are reacting to something real, just not something present. You are responding to a ghost. This is not a character flaw. It is a wound with a logic. And wounds do not close by being reopened repeatedly. They close by being named, traced back to their origin, and processed at the root. The person in front of you cannot do that work. They are not the source of the injury. They are just the latest stage on which you are performing an old drama. Recognizing that is the first real interruption of the pattern. But interrupting the pattern is only the beginning. Because the deeper question is, what does it actually feel like to stop needing them? What does wholeness feel like from the inside? Not as a concept, but as a lived reality. That is where we are going next. Wholeness is not what you think it is. It is not confidence that never wavers. It is not indifference to other people. It is not the absence of loneliness. Most people, when they imagine what it would feel like to stop needing validation, picture something cold, a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that seals them off from wanting anything at all. That is not wholeness. That is just a different kind of wound wearing a more dignified mask. What Jung meant by wholeness, what he spent his life mapping through the process he called individuation, is something far more specific. It is the condition of having a stable internal center that does not collapse when the external world withdraws its approval. Not because you stopped caring, but because your sense of existing, of mattering, of being real, no longer depends entirely on whether someone else confirms it. The difference shows up in small, concrete moments. You say something honest in a conversation, and the other person goes quiet, and you do not immediately begin apologizing, softening, rewinding. You make a decision based on what you actually want, and you do not spend 3 days calculating how it will be perceived. Someone pulls away, and you feel it. You are not numb. But you do not chase. You let the distance be what it is, because your value did not leave with them. That last part is the one that takes the longest to build. Because for most people who beg for affection, the emotional logic runs deep. I am only as real as I am wanted. When someone chooses you, you exist fully. When they withdraw, something essential goes with them. Wholeness is the slow, unglamorous process of decoupling those two things, your existence from their attention. It does not happen through insight alone. It happens through repetition, through choosing yourself in small moments, consistently, over a long period of time, until the internal center becomes weight-bearing. Jung was also clear that this is not a solitary achievement in the sense of isolation. The goal of individuation is not to need no one. It is to reach a place where connection is a choice rather than a rescue operation, where you enter a relationship as someone complete enough to give freely, not someone depleted enough to take desperately. The quality of what you bring to another person changes entirely when you are not using them to fill something that was always your own responsibility to fill. And here is the paradox that Jung returned to repeatedly. The people who stop begging do not become less attractive. They become magnetic, not because they learned a technique or adopted a posture, but because people can feel the difference between someone who wants them and someone who needs them. Need has a particular weight, a hunger that asks the other person to be responsible for something they cannot be responsible for. Want, coming from a place of fullness, feels entirely different. It feels like an invitation rather than a demand, like contact rather than consumption. This is the destination the work is pointing toward. But there is one more layer underneath all of this, one that most people never reach because it requires facing something they have spent years hiding, even from themselves. You have been burying parts of who you are to seem lovable, and those buried parts are not gone. They have been running your relationships from underground. In the next part, we'll bring them into the light and examine why the most confronting thing you can do is stop hiding what you have always believed would make people leave. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Hiding your darkness does not make you more lovable. It makes you unknowable. and you cannot be truly loved by someone who does not actually know you. Jung called the shadow the repository of everything you rejected in yourself in order to maintain the persona. Not just the dramatic things, the rage, the envy, the cruelty you are capable of under pressure, but the quieter things too. The neediness you learned to mask with self-sufficiency, the ambition you suppressed because it seemed arrogant, the grief you never allowed because someone taught you early that it was weakness, the opinions you swallowed because the room went cold when you expressed them. All of it, everything deemed unacceptable, inconvenient, or too much, got pushed down. And it did not disappear. It went underground and started operating without your permission. This is the mechanism most people miss. They believe that by hiding their shadow, they are protecting their relationships. In reality, they are sabotaging them. Because the shadow does not stay hidden. It leaks. It surfaces as disproportionate reactions to small provocations, a sudden coldness that you cannot explain, as the pattern of self-destruction that appears precisely when things start going well. You are not malfunctioning. You are experiencing the return of everything you refuse to integrate, pressing up through the cracks of the persona you have been maintaining at enormous psychological cost. And the cost extends into your relationships in a specific way. When you hide your shadow to seem lovable, you attract people who are drawn to the performance. People who need you to be agreeable, uncomplicated, consistently warm. And then you are trapped, because any authentic expression of who you actually are threatens the dynamic. You cannot be angry. You cannot be difficult. You cannot want something they are unwilling to give. The relationship becomes a cage built from your own self-suppression, and you call it love because you do not know what else to call something you worked this hard to maintain. What Jung proposed was integration, not expression without restraint, but conscious acknowledgement. You do not have to act on every shadow impulse. You have to stop pretending they do not exist. You have to look at the anger and say, "This is mine." Look at the envy and say, "This is mine." Look at the need and say, "This is mine." And it is not shameful, and I will not keep burying it to make someone else comfortable. That act of ownership, unglamorous, private, often painful, is what begins to dissolve the persona's grip. And something unexpected happens when you start showing up more fully. The people who were only there for the performance leave. This feels at first like confirmation of your worst fear, that the real you is too much, that the shadow material was correctly identified as unlovable. But stay with it, because what follows is something you may have never experienced before. The people who remain do so with full information. They are not staying for a carefully managed version of you. They are staying for you. And the connection that becomes possible in that context, the depth, the ease, the lack of constant vigilance, is categorically different from anything the persona ever produced. You have spent years editing yourself down to something you believed was lovable. The shadow work asks you to stop, not to perform authenticity. That is just another mask. But to genuinely tolerate being known. To let someone see the parts you were certain would end things, and discover that for the right person, they do not. That discovery does not come from thinking about it. It comes from risking it. And the cumulative effect of those risks, of showing up real, repeatedly, and surviving, is the thing that actually builds the internal foundation you have been trying to borrow from everyone else. That foundation has a name, and in the final part, we'll talk about what it means to stand on it, and why everything genuinely changes when you finally do. Everything we have covered in this video points to a single, uncomfortable truth. The begging was never about them. Not really. It was always about the relationship you failed to build with yourself, the parts you rejected, the wholeness you outsourced, the wounds you kept reopening in strangers who had no idea they were standing in for someone else entirely. That is not an easy thing to sit with. It is much more bearable to believe the problem is external, that you simply haven't found the right person yet, that the ones you chose were damaged, that with better luck, the hunger would finally be fed. But Jung's framework does not allow that exit. It points, with uncomfortable precision, directly inward. The pattern is yours. The projection is yours. The wound is yours. And therefore, and this is the part that is both devastating and liberating, the work is yours too. Here is the hardest truth of this video. Most people will not do that work, not because they are incapable, but because the begging, for all its pain, is familiar. It has a rhythm. You know how to suffer inside it. Wholeness, by contrast, is genuinely unknown territory. And the psyche resists the unknown with the same ferocity it resists pain. So people stay in the cycle. They beg, they collapse, they recover just enough to beg again. And they call this love because they have never stood still long enough to feel what love actually requires of them. What it requires is this: that you become someone who can exist fully without being chosen, not someone who pretends not to want connection. That performance is just another mask. But someone for whom connection is a genuine choice, rather than a survival strategy. Someone who can be alone without that aloneness, feeling like evidence of unworthiness. Someone who can be with another person without needing that person to hold their sense of reality together. Jung used an image that has stayed with me. He wrote about the difference between a person who reflects light and a person who generates it. The beggar reflects. Their brightness depends entirely on whether someone is shining on them. Turn away, and they go dark. But the person who has done the work of individuation generates their own light. They are not cold. They are not closed. They are complete. And from that completeness, connection becomes something extraordinary. Not a rescue, not a filling of lack, but two sources of light choosing to illuminate the same space. That is what stops the begging. Not a decision, not a technique, not a better set of boundaries written in a journal. It is the slow, painful, unglamorous construction of an internal life, rich enough that you are no longer willing to trade it for scraps. It is the accumulation of every moment you chose honesty over performance, solitude over desperate company, your own judgment over the need for approval. It does not happen at once, but it happens. And when it does, the change is not subtle. You stop tolerating what diminishes you, not out of pride, but because you genuinely cannot justify the cost anymore. You stop chasing people who are not moving toward you, not out of strategy, but because the energy it requires belongs to something more worthy of it. You stop performing, not because you mastered authenticity, but because the performance finally costs more than it returns, and you start, slowly, to become someone you do not need to escape from. The work is waiting for you. It has always been waiting. The only question is whether you are done using other people as a reason to avoid it. If something in this video landed, if something named what you have been carrying without quite having the words for it, sit with that, leave it in the comments, and when you are ready to go further, watch the next video, not because it is a suggestion, because what we covered here only goes so far, and what comes next takes it somewhere you need to go. Do not wait too long. The pattern doesn't.